Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness Tuesday afternoon webinar on addressing eviction and discrimination concerns during COVID-19. I'm Jason Weller with the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, and I know I traditionally say that we're very privileged in that we have a lot of amazing presenters and a lot of rock stars. And today, I think we've gotten a whole band together. But I'll introduce the bandmates here in a few minutes. So a couple of real quick housekeeping things. If you are new to joining us for webinars, or even if you're a seasoned grizzled veteran, but maybe have just need a quick reminder. So we do have a relatively large group with us today. So we will not be unmuting folks' microphones or phone lines. If you have any questions, the best thing to do is use the questions toolbar that's on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a little drop down. You click on that, type your question in, shoot it into Laurel and myself, and we will be monitoring those as they come in. Now we are gonna, because of the amount of material that our presenters are covering, we are gonna hold off and hold the questions until the end, just to make sure that somebody doesn't cover something first. So don't be alarmed if you put a question in and we don't acknowledge it right away. The other thing I want to point out is that we have a number of handouts available. I believe that each one of the presenters has a handout from their respective organization. And so you see those labeled. We also have a handout from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness and the materials they pulled together about renters' rights in the COVID-19 world. And then last but not least, we've got a PDF of today's presentation that includes the slides that all of the presenters will be covering. So those are, again, right-hand side of the screen. Handouts is the thing you'll be looking for, and please feel free to download all 5 of those or whatever combination you would like to. And after the session, in all likelihood, probably tomorrow or even Thursday, once we have the recording available and are able to pull the materials together, we'll be sending out a follow-up email. If for some reason you're unable to download any or all of the handouts, we will be sending those out to folks afterwards. I know that's a question we get on a regular basis, and we'll also send a link to the recording for today's session as well. So before I introduce the first panelist, I want to do a quick poll question because we want to get a sense of kind of what's happening with you essentially and where you're at right now and coming to an understanding of how things are going in this COVID-19 world that we're living in. Obviously, we know that certain things are not supposed to be happening, but at the coalition, at least, we've had anecdotal feedback from folks across the state that things are perhaps not going exactly as they're supposed to be, especially in terms of the eviction moratorium. So trying to get just do a quick check-in here and kind of see where folks are at in terms of whether or not they're hearing about evictions occurring in your community right now. So I've got a lot of people voting. So I think we'll give it maybe another 5 or 10 seconds, and that will be almost 3/4 of folks will have voted. Yeah. So perfect, and I'll share the results real quick. So near a little over 1/4 of you said that you're aware of evictions still happening in your community. A vast majority say no, 60%, and then but another 13% say that you're not sure, and that's totally fine. And that's one of the things that we hope to provide maybe some more insight onto what's happening in communities across the state with today's presentations. And then the second poll gets at, there we go, what additional resources? And this is one of those polls where you can actually have multiple responses. So please click on anything that seems relevant. I suspect a lot of you are going to say everything. and that's fine, but it gives us and I think the presenters some sense of kind of where y'all are at with the with how you're tailoring your agency or community response to housing issues you're running into. So we've got a lot of folks voting right now. Maybe keep this open for another 10 or 15 seconds. Give folks a bit more time to respond because I see the numbers are constantly changing. Okay. Well, we got about 2/3 of you have responded, and we're a minute in. So I think let's go ahead and close the poll and take a look. So in terms of the resources that you all are seeing needs for, I think not surprisingly, I think the only surprising thing with this is only 2/3 of you said it, but rental assistance funds. Public policy. So next on the list is at nearly 60% is public policy changes in terms of extending grace periods or repayment plans. Again, 61% of you landlord engagement, resources and toolkits, 54% education about tenant and applicant rights, and 63% said more housing options to present. And we are also hearing kind of anecdotally across the state that some housing markets are incredibly tight right now in terms of folks being able to find viable options to get people into. So not surprised by any of that. All right, so now let's turn it over to our first presenter. We've got Jim Shaftsmuth, who's a housing attorney at the Michigan Poverty Law Program. And Jim, the floor is yours.
Hey, great. Thank you, Jason, and the coalition and your colleagues there for this chance to be part of this webinar. And good afternoon to all of you who are participating in this event. And let me thank you for the good work that you're doing under these difficult and stressful circumstances that we find ourselves in. As Jason said, I'm Jim Shaftsmuth. I'm the housing attorney at the Michigan Poverty Law Program. MPLP seeks to provide support to advocates for Michigan's low-income residents. And I work on housing issues. I have colleagues who work in other areas of law, consumer law, public benefits, family law, and elder law. And so what we try to do takes various forms. That I consult a lot with attorneys and other housing advocates, mostly legal aid, legal services attorneys, but a lot of others as well, and work with a number of organizations, including the coalition, to promote the common interests of the people and clients whose interest we try to advance. Do a fair amount of legislative and administrative advocacy. I've been, over the course of the last couple of months, dealing with the governor's office more than I ever have. So that's been interesting and sometimes satisfying, and often frustrating work is this kind of work. And as I'm sure you know, when you're advocating on behalf of low-income people, there are a lot of barriers that we have to overcome, and not nearly as high as the ones that they have to overcome. But so, as you know, by having registered for this webinar, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the protections that the law has created for tenants in this COVID-19 space. And what I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about are two eviction moratoriums or eviction-related moratoriums. And you're probably familiar with both of them. So we'll try to fill in maybe some gaps or supplement the knowledge you have. And there's a good possibility you know everything that we're going to talk about. So maybe you can add to our understanding of them as well. So what I'm going to talk about, first of all, is the Michigan eviction moratorium. And just really quickly, by way of background, and you may have heard this framing of the eviction issue, but there are 5 stages in the eviction process, beginning with notice and then the filing of a complaint. And just to back up or halt for a minute, this is the legal eviction process, and we could spend a lot of time talking about illegal self-help evictions, but that's not going to be the focus, although we'd be happy to respond to questions about them, and have heard reports of those continuing to happen. Not surprisingly, I don't know if I could say that there has been an increase in the occurrence of self-help evictions. But so back to the legal eviction process, the first step in which is the issuance of notice, and then there's the filing of a court complaint, and then a court hearing, on that complaint, and then a court judgment, which unfortunately is usually in favor of the landlord. And then if the tenant doesn't, in the case of a non-payment of rent case, pay what's known as the redemption amount, pay off the amount that the court determines is owed to the landlord. Or if the tenant doesn't move out, then the last stage in the process is the actual eviction, the removal from the premises themselves. So in Michigan, we now have an eviction moratorium that the governor has established by way of a series, there have been 3 of them now, of executive orders. Here's a link to the current one. It's Executive Order 2020-85, which she signed last Thursday, and it extends through June the 10th, and we're hoping that it won't be its last extension. And this moratorium primarily provides protection at that last step in the eviction process, the actual physical eviction removal from the rental, or as this order says, the residential premises. And so what it prohibits, as you can see from this handout, is the removal or exclusion. This is the language that the order uses, from residential premises. So it only applies to housing situations. And I note in parentheses here that for purposes of providing protection from pandemic. So that's the basis for the governor having taken this executive action, as well as all of the other executive orders that she has issued. It's for purposes of providing protection from the pandemic, and that is a phrase that she uses often, and I guess the precise phrase is, due to the protection that a residential home provides from the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to contain self-quarantined and self-isolated individuals within a residential home. And then so on, and these are the protections. So there's really a public health foundation for this executive orders and the others. And what this one again prohibits is the removal from residential premises of tenants or land contract purchasers, buyers, sometimes called vendees, or persons holding under them. So, if someone is there, if their possession of property is derivative of a tenant or land contracts, that they also are protected by this moratorium. As well, it extends to their personal property. And so it prohibits by anyone the entry into residential premises to remove a tenant or one of these other protected categories of persons. And then there's some specific prohibitions, and this one kind of builds on the general prohibition against removal or exclusion, but specifically prohibits the enforcement of an eviction order or writ of restitution, which, as you probably all know, is one of the last steps in the eviction process, that the landlord applies to the court for an eviction order. The court issues the order, gives it to, it could be a sheriff's deputy or a court officer to actually carry out the physical eviction itself. And so this moratorium, this executive order, specifically prohibits the enforcement of those orders. And there are a lot of them waiting to be enforced. The report I heard from Detroit is that there are 500 or 463 is the number, and maybe it's grown even by now, of the eviction orders that are just waiting to be enforced and executed. So there is a halt on those now as well. This order specifically permits or or prohibits anyone from denying a mobile home owner access to a mobile home. The order doesn't specifically say this, but presumably in a mobile home park, although it doesn't say it, so I guess it really applies to any mobile home situation. And the scenario in which we see this arise is if there has been a judgment in an eviction case entered against the mobile home owner, and it requires them to move out of the mobile home, that this would place a stop on that process from happening. There's one significant exception, which you may have heard about, and that's if the occupant, one of these persons, and you can read the language, so presents a significant threat either to other people, or to the condition of the property itself. So that's primarily what this moratorium does, is provide protection at the back end of the eviction process. It also, and this is significant, provides some protection at the very front end, at the notice stage of the process. And what it prohibits is the issuance of demands for possession based on non-payment of rent and of land contract forfeiture notices. There is also a legitimate argument that the order, when read in its entirety and along with a cease and desist letter that the Attorney General sent to a landlord, that this executive order may prohibit any eviction notice. So that's not based purely on the direct language of the moratorium, but there's a reasonable argument that this moratorium prohibits the issuance of any eviction order. So we don't know that courts, fortunately, aren't hearing eviction cases now. So this order, again, provides some protection at the front end and the back end of the eviction process. Fortunately, the Supreme Court and the State Court Administrative Office, which is the court's administrative arm, has almost entirely halted the holding of eviction cases, so action on eviction cases. So there have been these breaks applied. They're starting to be eased. So there's increasing concern that eviction cases may be resuming in the near future. So I think we can move to the next slide, please.
Jim, may I ask a really quick clarifying question that's already come in?
Yes.
One of our attendees asked if they have a number of folks who are on month-to-month leases. Does the protections extend to folks who are on month-to-month, or can those landlords still give a 30-day notice to quit?
Well, that's a question. I think, well, certainly the prohibition against evictions covers month-to-month tenants, any tenants, regardless of whether they have a lease, and regardless of the term of that. And in terms of the notices themselves, as I said, what we call the plain language of the order does not prohibit the issuance of other eviction notices, such as the termination of tenancy notice that a month-to-month tenant would be likely to get. But there is a legal argument that when it's read in its entirety, that the order, and given the purposes of the order, this public health purpose to the order, and housing stability, keeping people in their houses, which protects both the housed family as well as the rest of the population, that there is a strong argument that that prohibition against eviction notices also includes these termination of tenancy notices for month-to-month tenants and other tenancy situations. So
Perfect.
quickly, just a couple of a couple of things that the order doesn't do. It doesn't cancel or suspend the obligation to pay rent. Again, as we've already talked about, it limits what landlords can do in terms of telling tenants that they are behind on rent, including the issuance of demand for possession notices. It doesn't prohibit state courts or our district courts from moving forward on eviction cases. As I've said, that there's guidance from the Supreme Court and the SCAO that has, in effect, placed a halt on eviction cases, maybe with a very few exceptions. I get scattered reports of courts being eager to resume these cases, so there isn't an outright halt or suspension on them, but practically speaking, there mostly is. But the court is moving toward easing some of those limits on district courts from dealing with eviction matters, but they would still be subject to this eviction moratorium that prevents actual evictions themselves. And what it doesn't do, so the governor's executive orders are limited in their applicability to the period of the state of emergency. So if the state of emergency is lifted, these executive orders, including this one, would also no longer be in effect. And this current one expires next month, so there's a little cushion here, but this time goes quickly. We hope that it will be extended for a further period of time, that governors in other states have extended their eviction moratoriums well beyond this time. And so we're hoping the governor will extend this one again. We think that she's been doing a good job. We're always urging her to do more and asking that these orders be more comprehensive. But as you know, I mean, she faces a lot of pushback from the legislature and others about what she's doing. So she's trying to navigate a pretty careful path, but we support and appreciate all that she's been doing. So I'm probably over time already, but quickly going to move on to talking about some protections under federal law. And I don't know if you can show my screen or not, Jason, but if you can, now would be a good time for doing that. And so,
setting it up right now, Jim.
And so this federal law came through what's called the CARES Act, which is a law that was enacted in March, which I guess 7 weeks ago. In some ways, it seems like it was much longer ago than that, and in others, a much shorter time away. And so this moratorium applies to a more limited range of tenancies. And so it applies to any tenancy in what I'll call a federally related property. So that can be a property, and just quickly to take you through this. So what I'm showing you is the actual language of this section in the CARES Act, section 4024, and it applies to covered dwellings, which are units in a covered property, and a property can be covered if it participates in almost any federal rental assistance program, public housing, Section 8, the low-income housing tax credit program, ESG supported tenancies, continuum of care housing assistance supported tenancies. So about the only thing it doesn't cover, to my knowledge, is our tenancies that are assisted solely under the federal home program. That's home, all in caps, that you may have heard about before. So it's going to cover tenancies in almost all of the federally subsidized housing programs. It also covers tenancies in properties which have what's called a federally backed mortgage. You can see that term here. So what that means are properties that have mortgages that are insured or assisted by the federal government. So that would include any HUD mortgage, any FHA mortgage, rural development mortgages, VA mortgages, then as well as mortgages which are now owned by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, these so-called enterprise organizations which purchase a lot of mortgages. So this covers a substantial number of mortgages. And so if a tenant lives in a unit which either whose property participates in any of these programs, and they are covered by this moratorium. And here's what the moratorium is. So during the 120-day period from the date of this statute becoming law, which is March 27th, so it carries through July 25, that a landlord, the lessor, can't file with a court a complaint, is what we call it in Michigan, to recover possession of the rental unit from the tenant for non-payment of rent or other fees of charges. So anything related to non-payment of rent, that would include a traditional pure non-payment of rent case upon a 7-day demand for possession, which again, owners, which all landlords in Michigan currently can't issue, as well as anything related to non-payment of rent or other charges, including termination of tenancy actions, as well during this 4-month period, that these landlords can't charge any late fees. And then there's this next significant protection for tenants, which is another type of notice protection. And so what these landlords can't do, as you can see, is require a tenant to move out until a landlord serves a 30-day notice. And that notice cannot be served until these 120 days expire. So what that practically means for landlords of these covered properties, of these tenancies in covered properties, is that a landlord won't be able to file an eviction complaint for non-payment of rent until near the end of August. There's also another question about the scope of the notice protection, under this statute, and whether it only covers non-payment of rent related cases, or if it's broader than that because of this subsection C, which doesn't make any reference to the earlier paragraph. So again, another legal argument that could be made, that this moratorium prohibits the filing of any eviction complaints against tenants in these covered properties. And there's a great, what I'm showing you now is a really great resource. Where am I going here? So this preservation database, and it is, I don't know if I can advance this or not, but this is a great resource for identifying whether a property participates in a subsidized housing program, any of those programs that the CARES Act covers. And then it's also, and I'm waiting for it to, I don't know why I can't, oh, there it is. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit of a knucklehead here, but it's not letting me advance. Here's what I'm looking for. This is a great resource. So it identifies all of the covered programs. Maybe I should have shown this earlier, as well as, if you see under question 2, there is an ability to identify whether or not the property that a tenant lives in has a federally backed mortgage. So even if a tenant isn't participating in one of the federally assisted subsidy programs, you can identify if the tenant is living in a property with a federally backed mortgage, at least if it's a multifamily property. It's harder to identify if it's a 1 to 4 unit property. There are some ways to doing that. And this resource provides a way to assist in doing that. So it's preservationdatabase.org is a great resource to use, and knowing whether a property is subject to these CARES Act eviction filing moratorium protections. So sorry if I took a little more time than I was allotted, Jason, but that's all I think I have to say for now.
Okay, perfect, Jim. No, actually, you read my mind. I was just about to give you a little nudge and say we got to make sure we have time for our other panelists. So thank you very much for that. I will actually take back the screen real quick and then tee things up for Todd. Okay, so there we go. So now, next up, we have Todd Pierce Ryan, who's a staff attorney at Lakeshore Legal Aid. And I know we've had about 25 or so people join us since we got started. There are handouts that not only is there the handout with the PowerPoint slides, but there's also handouts for each of these agencies. So there is a legal aid handout that's a packet of materials that Todd has shared that Todd has shared with everybody. So without further ado, Todd, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Todd Pierce Ryan. I'm a staff attorney with Lakeshore Legal Aid. And so I'm going to go through the handouts that are attached and the information in them. Jason, I just ask you to go back one slide just because I'm not ready for the federal coverage yet. And I'll just let you know when it's time to move forward. So just a little background for anyone who's not familiar. Lakeshore Legal Aid is a nonprofit that provides free legal services to low-income people. We operate in Southeast Michigan, including Detroit and the surrounding areas, and there's other nonprofits across the state who also provide free legal services with federal funding called Legal Services Corporation funding. And so if you go to the handouts that we've provided, we have a couple of flyers in there with contact information for our hotline. So that is both in English and in Spanish. It's pages 2 and 3 of the handout. So Jim's provided a detailed overview of the federal and state eviction moratorium, but there are some questions about both of those moratoriums, and different people will have different particular factual situations, like what they're actually living and experiencing with their landlord. And so we do recommend that people who are looking for actual legal advice, so that's tailored answers to questions that they have about their situation, to contact an attorney to consult with them. So it's always good to have the general knowledge, but there's no replacing the actual tailored legal advice. So the hotline is how you can access legal services across the state. And then if there's more needed than legal advice over the phone, it gets referred to the local organization, which may or may not be able to take the case on for representation, just because we do have limited resources. So just wanted to make sure to provide that first and foremost as the kind of background of the resources that we provide and how to connect people with those legal resources. And again, today we're focusing on housing and the eviction moratorium, but we do provide legal advice and representation on other matters that would affect, in particular, homeless populations. So going to the actual eviction moratoria that are in place right now, Jim mentioned that the legal way to conduct an eviction is through court process. And I have heard, not through any concrete numbers or whatnot, but just anecdotally from the city of Detroit in particular, that there has been an increase in illegal evictions. So an illegal eviction is when somebody forces another person to leave the property without a court order. The landlord, specifically the property owner, whoever's illegally evicting that person. And so basis, in particular in the city of Detroit, and it would happen less commonly across the entire state. And so there's a press release in the flyer that we attached that speak about the harms that illegal evictions can cause. So if you have a landlord that kicks the door in and throws you out, there's a harm associated with that, and you can hold the landlord responsible for it. So it can be that you're immediately rendered homeless and that you're living on the streets for 6 months. And that was the situation for the client in this case. And so the landlord can be held responsible. It doesn't always happen, and this is one of those things to seek legal advice and legal representation. But if the court does hold the landlord responsible, they can be responsible for 3 times the amount of harm caused to the tenant, and that can include emotional distress and mental anguish. So the harms of being homeless for 6 months because the landlord illegally threw you out, as well as loss of all your personal possessions and other harms that it may have caused. So just want to make sure that there's the context for that, that there's been an increase in illegal eviction complaints that we've heard about, and that landlords should be aware that there's severe consequences that the law can provide. And unfortunately, it happens and people get away with it, but we really want to make sure to highlight that. And if people have an illegal eviction situation, in general, we encourage them to contact the police and to have the ability to demonstrate that they're a tenant and they themselves didn't kick the door in and were a squatter in the property. But this is the situation where legal representation can make a big difference as well. So turning to the court evictions, turning to the legal evictions, Jim already covered this pretty comprehensively. I just want to lay out the framework a little bit. So we have the federal eviction moratorium that he covered the actual language of, and that's done by a federal law that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. In the state, we have the governor's executive order that also puts an eviction moratorium in place statewide, and that's separate from and in addition to the federal eviction moratorium. There's also local court practice that Jim mentioned, and that's in compliance with the state Supreme Court's administrative orders and directive, and local practice can vary. So this information is accurate as of today, May 19th at 1:39 p.m. Everything's changing very quickly. At one point in time last week, we had a different date for the federal eviction moratorium, a different date for the state governor's eviction moratorium, and a different date because the 36th District Court in Detroit had extended the eviction moratorium past the governor's date. So we had 3 different dates that were applying in the city of Detroit. Some of them were in addition to and on top of the others. So in that one, the shortest date was the governor's former order, which was going to expire. And then if you were in the city of Detroit, it wouldn't have moved forward for any case on a later date. And then if you were in a federal property, a federally related property in the city of Detroit, it wouldn't have moved forward until a 3rd date. So again, this goes to the importance of keeping track of the different changes that are happening and making sure that there's the connection with legal advice. And so as of right now, the statewide moratorium is in place until June 11th. A landlord that is, physically throwing somebody out on the street, that's an illegal eviction. There's lots of different forms of illegal eviction. It can be threats, it can be shutting off utilities. There's a lot of different versions of it. Moral of the story is it's forcing somebody to leave a property that they don't want to leave. You can always agree to leave a property, but you can't be forced to. And so just want to turn to the next slide, which is the federal moratorium. And this is just kind of the summation of what Jim had already talked about in a little bit of a, more publicly accessible handout. This is based on a flyer from Legal Services of South Central Michigan. And this is just kind of detailing the eviction moratorium from the federally related properties. And so Jim already covered this, so I'll be brief. I just want to highlight that the resource that Jim pointed you to, which he mentioned, it's not comprehensive or exclusive. So there are federally related properties that will not show up on that database, but it's a great starting point to know if a property is covered. But if a property doesn't show up on that, it could still be covered. And then these are the protections that are coming from the federal law. And so just want to include that the landlord can't charge late fees. They can't send you a notice to vacate for non-payment of rent or file an eviction case under this federal law. Jim mentioned that these provisions, the federal and state eviction moratorium, don't change the obligation to pay rent. So I want to make sure to emphasize that, but also say that all the defenses that a tenant has to paying rent are still applicable. So the landlord's claims still exist with some modifications on their ability to move forward with eviction court cases, which is getting possession of the property through the court action. And they also limit some of the landlord's abilities to, for example, charge late fees. But that means that the tenant's defenses are still live. So if the tenant had a defense based on the condition of the property or some other reason, then they still have the defense afterward. So that pretty much, I just want to make sure to highlight this, the practical context of the eviction moratorium. What we've been seeing is a lot of people with questions, and there's a lot of confusing information because this is kind of a complicated situation with different federal, state, and local laws and guidelines and rules. And it's both from the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And so Jim's been a wonderful resource statewide for us in keeping track of these things. And then we're, advising individual clients on their individual rights in the particular context where they live and with their landlord. Everyone's tendency is different, and the risks and benefits of different courses of action are different in the assertion of their rights. So that's what we are doing in this context, and I'll keep mine brief and turn my time over to the fair housing and non-discrimination side, and I'd be happy to address questions at the end of the session if people had specific questions.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, it looks like we've had a steady stream of questions coming in between the end of Jim's presentation and your presentation. So I think let's table those for the end, and you made a great segue. Let's move now to Liz Keegan, the Director of Education and Outreach for the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, and since you've been able to provide everyone with my slides, I'm hoping we can actually jump forward to the third slide that has the list of protected classes. So very briefly, I want people to understand that fair housing centers across Michigan can get involved when there's a difference of treatment that can be proven, which is a challenge, as we all know as advocates, that people are being treated differently in their housing access, in the application process, advertising, and of course, even post-housing acquisition, some fair housing laws can help apply. We're concerned about the inequities that we're hearing and starting to see, but in order for it to be considered a fair housing issue, the difference has to be because of these protected classes. And there's 9 of them that apply across the state. So you've got the federal list there, race, color, national origin, et cetera, followed by 2 more at the state level, marital status and age. And then as I mentioned, I'm providing the local fair housing center contact information at the end of my slides. So you can see which fair housing center would serve you by their websites. We are in Grand Rapids, but cover north of Grand Rapids all the way really up through the UP. So you're welcome to start with me. The protections can vary by city ordinance as well. So there's some homework to be done. We have an interesting gray area for sexual orientation protections here in the state of Michigan. So there's some protection for that across the state, but it officially hasn't become law. And then HUD programs also prohibit discrimination under their purview based on sexual orientation. But if you're not sure if something is a fair housing issue, I encourage you to take a look at the list of protections. And if you're finding that a policy or an impact is negatively impacting one of these groups, then it's likely something that should be explored with a fair housing lens. If we can pop forward, I just want to raise awareness that Michigan law has the potential to be expanded officially under Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act with these particular groups. The laws have been proposed. They were proposed before the current pandemic, so I don't expect action and attention returning to them right away, but they have been brought forth as possible protections, and we'll scoot forward to another list here. Essentially, as you can tell if you quickly scan this list, fair housing laws cover most housing in Michigan. So it's a safe assumption that there's some sort of civil right or fair housing law that would apply to housing that's available in exchange for payment, including empty lots, mobile homes, apartment communities, HOAs, condos, you name it. So I wanted to actually move forward, I think probably again, just to stop here for a second and say that we're a private nonprofit. So we are celebrating 40 years of fair housing service this year. So we've been around for a little while, and we're very happy to share our education and knowledge about fair housing, but we do not have attorneys and we cannot provide legal advice. So I want to be clear about that, but our primary task is to help people understand what housing discrimination looks like, accept complaints of housing discrimination through our intake process, and conduct investigations, because it goes back to that piece that I started with. We have to be able to prove that unfair treatment is happening because of a protected class. So our primary task is doing that investigation and helping people advocate for their housing choice free from discrimination. And we have a strong education component to that. So if anybody's interested, please let me know. I'm happy to talk to teams or log in to provide a webinar all on fair housing. Just let us know. But you know, all of us know as housing advocates that where we live dictates how we live and the quality of life that we have. So having that equal choice is really critical. So if we can pop forward, I want to focus more on the trends that we wanted to share. And I apologize for moving quickly, but I also want to reserve some time for dialogue and questions. So some of the things that we're concerned about, thinking again of our list of protected classes and things that we're hearing about either nationally or starting to hear from people, as you mentioned, Todd, kind of anecdotally, we're concerned that people will be treated differently based on their race, whether or not they speak English well, maybe they have a less than stellar rental or criminal history background, maybe they're not as versed with understanding the law. So much of this is so complicated, and I commend all of you for presenting this information in a way that breaks it down and makes it more accessible even for me, so I appreciate that. But anytime your radar is tweaking, I guess, and you're thinking something isn't right, and it's because of a protected class in these processes that we're seeing, we're expecting that negative behavior, adverse behavior will be targeted to people who are more vulnerable and who might represent a protected class, for example, like national origin. We're also concerned, and we're starting to see these cases kind of bubble up in the national media, that sexual harassment is on the rise. Unfortunately, these are things that we don't hear about necessarily right away. So please let us know if you're hearing about it from clients. You know, when income is affected, then predatory landlords or housing managers will try to set up a sexual relationship in exchange for keeping the housing or providing maintenance. In the modern days of technology, a lot of this is captured by text or social media, so the evidence is actually there, and it's hard to see, but it makes a very compelling case for what people are being subjected to. There's a brave mom coming out of Indiana who just shared her story where the landlord was trying to get her to come spend the night when she notified him that she had lost her job. And she actually got him to admit it in the text thread. So as I said, she's a brave young woman. The National Fair Housing Alliance is starting to hear issues, and of course we've seen some general stories about harassment or hate crime activity targeted towards Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. We would expect that this would filter into the housing arena as well. And as these housing protections and the guidance on these various levels of protections evolve, you know, we think that we will see selective treatment based on the protected classes that either favors certain groups or leaves behind certain groups. So that's something that we are really concerned about as these protections expire, and thankfully they have been extended, but we know that at some point eventually they will lift. And I think we will then see some challenges as to who gets access to what benefits. So if we can skip forward one more. We're very concerned, and we've actually had multiple calls from persons with disabilities, especially older adults with disabilities, who have been told that their outside caregivers, either through hired services or through family members, are being denied entrance into communities. This is something that we've been able to jump on and get some education out to those communities to restore that access to those caregivers for people with disabilities. Typically, this happens in independent living where there are no other options for healthcare. The staff is not set up to do anything to help. And so it's critical that that access gets restored. We also see other delays and negative treatment of people with disabilities. There's a big question about whether COVID and your status as a person with or without COVID might be considered a disability under law. So, and then finally here, you can skip forward one more. Long term, we're gonna look at the demographic effects and impacts of some of these the steps that are taken, how people are treated. You know, I think something to watch for now too, and to alert us for, or your local fair housing centers, any predatory scams that are seemingly targeted at any of the protected classes. So those, you do have the contact information of the Michigan Fair Housing Centers and mine on the last slide. to find us online. So feel free to reach out to me and I'll connect you to your group, or or go to them directly if you know who they are. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jason, so we can grab some questions, because I'm sure there's lots.
There's fewer than would be expected, but I think some of these are maybe very, very broad ranging in terms of who responds. So thank you, Liz. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Jim. And I know that we're bumping up against 2 o'clock, and Jim actually has another engagement. But given that we have over 70 folks still on, and we have a handful of questions, if folks don't mind, we can certainly go a little past 2 if we need to. So that being said, I think the first, so there's a couple of related questions we've received, and the first around the eviction moratorium in the CARES Act versus the state level. And so the first question is clarifying, the CARES Act applies to any type of eviction, not just eviction for non-payment of rent. And Jim or Todd, I don't know which one of you wants to take the lead with that. Yeah.
This is Todd. It clearly applies to non-payment of rent. There's a question on whether it applies to all eviction notices, and Jim covered that briefly. And so, we're going to advocate aggressively on behalf of our clients and try to have that apply to all evictions in federally related properties, but we can never guarantee what a judge will say, and we can advise the individual clients as to their potential risks and benefits of moving forward in that context. And so that's again the importance of the kind of the individualized considerations for that person to consider.
Yeah, and this is Jim, just to add to what Todd said. So I started out talking about the 5 stages of the eviction process, really the CARES Act. So the federal protection covers stage 1 notice and stage 2 filing of complaint. And so what it does not do in its current form is prohibit landlords, so these federally related landlords who filed a case before March 27 from pursuing that case once the Michigan courts basically open back up and resume hearing eviction cases. As it stands now in that situation, the Michigan eviction moratorium would provide protection to those tenants and any other tenants and land contract buyers, and as I said, the persons holding under them would provide the moratorium on the enforcement of eviction orders, the last stage in the process. So, in some sense, it's a case of where one ends and the other picks up. So there's some tenants who will be covered by both, some only by one or the other. So as Todd said, excuse me, Todd, that it really does involve an individualized assessment.
So we have a related question. We have a provider from Hillsdale County who is basically saying that they are seeing a docket of evictions that are coming through the system. Are there any circumstances where courts would still be proceeding with evictions that aren't covered either between the state or the federal moratoria?
So probably not, but maybe. So as I understand where the Supreme Court, the Michigan Supreme Court, and the SCAO, the State Court Administrative Office are, that I don't think they would yet be approving of local courts, local district courts moving forward on eviction cases without approval of SCAO, and maybe that's happening. I did not know it to be happening. And in those instances where it may be happening, that would be something to reach out to the local legal services, so legal services of South Central Michigan, about. And still, even in those situations, those tenants would still have the protection of the Michigan eviction moratorium and may have the protection of the federal moratorium if they're living in one of those federally related properties. I don't think we mentioned, but in Michigan courts now, there is a form that landlords of these federally related tenancies must file an affidavit when they file a non-payment of rent case. Well, really, of any landlord filing a non-payment of rent case must file this affidavit stating whether the property is covered by the CARES Act or not. So that's something that must be happening at least in any non-payment of rent case. But yes, if we're not in that time, maybe in Hillsdale, Lenawee County, where courts are resuming activity, which would surprise and alarm me a bit, that time is probably coming closer. But tenants, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but would still have that last stage protection under current law, under the governor's current executive orders.
So there's a follow-up question then. The person, Jessica, is already working with Mike from Legal Services of South Central Michigan. Is there somebody that that any of you know who they could be reporting this to?
Yeah, you know what I'll do, this is Jim again, I'll follow up with Mike about that to see what he knows about what's happening there.
Okay, perfect.
And of general note statewide, the state level eviction moratorium does contain an exception for substantial risks to people or property. Like if there's a substantial health risk because of the tenant is allegedly causing some sort of dangerous situation at the property, there's an exception for those types of emergency filings. It's very limited and shouldn't be filling up a court docket, but just wanted to mention that there is an explicit exception for those type of cases to move forward.
Okay, perfect. And then there's another, so not so much, I think Dana intended to make this as a comment, but it kind of segues into a resource question. So Dana, who works at MDHHS, was commenting early on about some of the resources that SER offer for folks in terms of helping out with financial assistance. Are there any other financial resources that you all collectively are aware of that are either currently online or in the process of coming online that would be able to help folks with their rent or mortgage situation?
This is Liz. This is something we've been digging around a little bit on, and this is out of our wheelhouse, but we like to make good referrals if possible. And in the interim of finding something specific, we've been telling people to contact their local 211 United Way call for help programs in hopes that they would have the latest information on that, but I'm not aware of any that are providing direct rental assistance or mortgage.
So there are, yeah, so another part of the CARES Act, there are several parts of it. You know, for example, that's the law that created the $1,200 stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment assistance. So it did a lot. It also then provided some funding to some additional funding to some existing programs. And the ones I'll mention you've probably heard about are the ESG program. So there's a substantial supplement to ESG funding as well as CDBG programs. So if you don't know already how that works is that some of the money goes directly to larger cities and counties, and then the rest goes to the state of Michigan. So the Michigan Economic Development Corporation administers the CDBG money, and MISTA administers the ESG money. Then that goes out with conditions and requirements and terms to local governments, smaller local governments and agencies, for example, community action agencies in those areas. So the places to reach out to are either the local continuum of care, local in larger cities, community development departments or their equivalent, and to community action agencies to find out that money is starting to filter to cities and counties and other local entities. So there's tens of millions of dollars. It's a lot of money, but in terms of how far it's going to go, it's not much. But there is some funding, and there's some other potential funding, and it's hoped for that there's going to be another installment of federal legislation that will provide significantly more funding in the form of rental assistance. And there was a law or an act that the House of Representatives, Congressional House of Representatives, passed last week that's in the Senate and not moving at all there.
And just a
Perfect.
concrete example of that, in Detroit, Wayne Metro is currently processing applications for rental assistance, and they've received some of the federal funding. But then there's also United Community Housing Coalition, which has received separate private foundation money, and they're trying to reach out to people with active eviction judgments against them. So there's, additional potential pots of money besides the CDBG and ESG, but it would be kind of local considerations and working the support network in your various jurisdiction.
Thank you. And I'm looking, this may actually be a good note to end on. Well, other than also somebody, one of our providers up in the Eastern UP also echoed the sentiment that Liz shared about reaching out to 211, and that's something that they're advising folks to do as well. I think we're at the point where we've addressed all the questions or comments that have come in, and we are just a little after 2, but I do see that we're starting to lose folks. So I think let's go ahead and wrap it up. So again, Jim, Todd, Liz, thank you all immensely for taking the time this afternoon to share your expertise and knowledge with everybody on the call. Given the questions and comments that were coming in, you're obviously these are topics that are that folks out in the field are dealing with, and this is good information for them to have. So again, thank you. And at this point, as a reminder, kind of housekeeping, I will do a follow-up email. It'll likely be Thursday afternoon. We'll have the recording from today's session. We'll also have the materials. We'll send that out to everybody, as well as of course, you'll have the presenter's contact information as well. So if you have follow-up questions, you'll be more than welcome to reach out to them directly. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Tuesday afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Take care, everyone.